So
Sorry about that.
I'm honored and thrilled to be here. I'm sorry, I have to push continued, I think. There we go. Since it means that I'm here on Shelter Island, which is one of our favorite places on Earth. I'd like to start by acknowledging also that our Shelter Island is also the land of the Manhasset people who preceded us, and as they say, are still here. And though this acknowledgement is becoming more customary in this transformative year, it's also, in a way, directly tied to the subject of this book. Because though the plum tree had its origins around a tale of escape from Auschwitz, it ended up evolving into a study of the step-by-step breakdown of basic social justice, which led, in this case, to Auschwitz, or in other cases, to slavery or the appropriation of other people's lands. And when I started writing this book in 2010, I never expected that we would see people in Camp Auschwitz hoodies on the steps of our own Capitol in 2021, or that a congresswoman would be comparing a vaccination mandate to people being forced to wear what she called the Nazi gold stars. In other words, I didn't expect or even want this book to be relevant. The fact that it is suddenly proves one of its points, which is that it takes all that a society has to avoid a Holocaust. That particular kind of violent hatred that requires some designated other is always lurking. And the miracle is that we here in America do our best to confront and beat it back before we have people on the train to Auschwitz. Perfect we are not, but committed we are to an ever more perfect union. I'm always interested in how books get started, the first spark that actually catches fire and turns from mild interest to driving passion to an actual book. For me, I often find out that I'm going to have to sit down and write when I find myself over drinks or at the checkout line in the market talking about, say, Joan of Arc rather than Britney Spears. That's when I know that I'll be at my desk or at the library in the morning and won't be thinking about much else for a while. But this book started entirely differently, with an ambush, you might say, at a funeral. A beloved uncle had just died, and I was devastated. We were standing around the house afterwards when an old woman approached me with a letter that he had supposedly written. I wasn't in the mood to read a letter, but she was persistent. And when I saw that it was dateline, Germany, August 1945, intrigued. My uncle had been in the army, so among the conquering heroes over there that August, once the war had ended. The letter was to my grandfather, his father, in Ohio, and opened nicely enough with a recounting of some of the adventures of him and his fellow GIs in Paris. Drinking his first vin blanc, as he wrote, and dancing in a semi-cabaret, whatever that was. Charming, I said. But read, she said. I did. And soon enough, we moved from escapades in Paris to a displaced persons camp in Bavaria. My uncle had somehow found two young cousins, Clara and Alice, who had survived Auschwitz. And these two girls gave him what he wrote as the worst of all news, that all of my grandfather's family still in Europe had been killed. This, of course, wasn't news to us. We'd all grown up with this story in the background. It was still sad, though, and hard to have to read it in real time in a first-hand account, but not news. But then, toward the end, there were a few lines that actually were news. Clara and Alice told my uncle that my grandfather's brother, Herman, had escaped from the camp. I reread what my uncle had written. Herman was at Auschwitz concentration camp with them, and as he was very strong and healthy, they have hopes that he may be alive. They do know that he escaped from the concentration camp. Was this possible? And how ironic for this bombshell to fall into my hands the very day that we buried the one person I could have asked. For starters, who were Clara and Alice? I'd never heard any mention of them, and now there was no way to find out. Plus, this wasn't the story that we'd grown up with. We'd been told that Herman, a Czech, had refused to leave his country even when my grandfather had gotten him an exit visa to America, since Czechoslovakia was, as Herman wrote, a democracy like America. Then, because of this fatal, if noble, miscalculation, he'd been sent like a lamb to slaughter. But if he had escaped, if instead of a lamb he was in fact an underground hero, defying the Third Reich in the very heart of the place, suddenly the colors of the whole story changed. What had been nothing but gray ash suddenly had a streak of deep heroic red. I decided to drive across LA, where I was living then, to the Museum of Tolerance, which had a library. I thought I'd spend an afternoon and see if I could find anything that might shed light on this minor family mystery. The library did not have anything apropos on the shelves, at least at first glance, but as I was leaving, a small notice caught my eye. A survivor from Auschwitz would be speaking shortly. I thought I'd wander over to the museum to hear her. I don't remember exactly what she said. She wasn't the most scintillating or intensive of the speakers. But as I joined the school children afterwards, as she invited us to approach to see the numbers tattooed on her arm, I found myself in tears and unable to speak, even to thank her. She looked at me and nodded. She must have seen it before. That response to the whole tragedy, narrowed to a single tribute, mute and tearful on a sunny afternoon. I started going daily. I became aware that this was a great gift on offer, this last real window into another world, although a terrifying one. And I found I couldn't not go. I found myself sitting among the school children day in, day out, taking in yet another scene from what I was coming to see as a tragedy cycle, not unlike those of Sophocles or Euripides, only one that was set not in ancient Greece that we could only imagine, but a mere 75 years ago in a place that we could easily visit, with those who had lived to tell the tale still here to talk. Some of the speakers were better than others, more dramatic. Among these was a Greek who held an auditorium of Hispanic high schoolers rapt. They knew little or nothing about this chapter in history. It meant nothing to them. But this man had been 15, your age, he told the kids, when he'd been dragged from his bed in Thessalonica in his summer pajamas and jammed into a boxcar to Auschwitz with no food and worse, no water for days. Half of his family died on the train. He survived in the end because he was young and lucky. He told the kids of seeing his sister across the barbed wire in the camp just before she was killed. She'd had long, beautiful hair to her waist and beautiful clothes when they took her, but now her head was shaved and she was dressed in filthy stripes. He started to cry when he saw her and threw her a crust of bread, but a guard noticed and beat him away from the fence. He never saw his sister again. The kids nodded. They had sisters. Some of the girls were in tears. By then, time was up. The teachers were at the door. The bus was waiting, but the kids refused to leave. The Greek had gotten to the part where, after the war, in Berlin, he chanced upon the SS man who'd shot his cousin point blank at Auschwitz. He had just started chasing him down through the streets. The kids were cheering. "You catch him?" "What do you think?" said the Greek. He'd been a boxer, he told them, he and his brothers, amateur champions in his hometown. "How'd you kill him?" the kids were shouting. "With a gun?" The Greek held up his fists. "With these." Or not, I was thinking. But then he pulled out the ID, swastika pins and badges he'd taken from the SS man's pockets. The school kids crowded around to have a look. He showed them his tattoo. They showed him theirs. He was old and short, but still strong, he told the boys. "Watch out." He showed them some of his boxing moves. They shook his hand, almost as reverent as I was. I realized I'd found a hero. I found lots of them, actually, all of them, among both the drowned and the saved, as Primo Levi put it. I no longer saw anyone as a lamb to slaughter. I listened to story after story and was awestruck that anyone had found the strength to live through and live on. I studied the photos of people arriving at Auschwitz, the worried faces, and felt their heroism as they stood on that platform, on their way, as I knew, but they didn't, to the gas, with their arms around their children, still hoping to save them. Heroes all. It was around them then that this book ended up taking form and also moved into fiction. I wanted to take the reader there into this tragedy as dramatically as I'd been taken. But to do that, I had to tell a whole story, and what I found was that no one witness does. One tells about being expelled from music school in Vienna, another about being betrayed by the man who'd forged their papers, another about selection for life or death on the platform at Auschwitz. It's these stories braided together that give a full picture of how it happened, how it could have, would have happened to me or to you. It is this interweaving that makes the book fiction, although there's nothing fictional in these pages. Every detail comes from someone's firsthand account. I was first thinking about reading a passage about Herman's struggles with the local thugs who had taken power in his small town, the beginning of the end for these people. But after what we witnessed on January 6th, I decided to read from this chapter instead, which I'm afraid now falls within the range of our experience too. This is chapter 4. It was the late fall of 1938. The trees were bare by then, and there was a growing sense among Herman and his family that they should have left the day they got the affidavit from America. But visas to America were no longer possible. The cold came fast and early that year, and the news from Germany was always worse. There had been a rampage there in November. The papers blamed a young Polish boy whose parents had been killed by the Nazis and who in turn had shot a German diplomat in Paris. The German people, outraged, had risen up spontaneously and broken shop windows and burnt houses of worship. They called it Kristallnacht, Night of the Crystal, for all the broken glass. Bad news, Herman and his friends shook their heads. But at least explicable. A hooligan rampage that had gotten out of hand. But that wasn't how it was. It was far worse than that, said a young woman who had been there. She was passing through their village, hopping from train to train, heading east, and Herman's wife had invited her to dinner. After a few glasses of Plum brandy, she started to talk. She was a student studying philosophy at the University of Bonn and had been visiting an elderly aunt in the nearby town of Kokum on the Mosel River. Kokum, said Herman's wife, it was famous for its wines. They'd been there once on holiday. A nice town, she said. Nice? The girl gave a short laugh. She lifted her glass and drank it down. They saw that her hand was trembling. Go on, Herman urged her. It started the night of the 9th of November. She and her aunt were already asleep in their beds. When she heard the first shouting, very close, she thought she was dreaming. Her aunt lived in a very quiet neighborhood, prosperous and solid. No place for an uproar of any sort. But then there came more shouting, followed by a scream, a shot, and a woman's voice very close. My God, he's dead. Who? She jumped from her bed. A distinguished doctor lived next door. Had thieves broken into his house and killed him? The girl ran into the hall to the telephone to call the police, but the line was first busy and then dead, and the noise from the street was getting worse. Was it a whole gang of thieves then? But didn't thieves act in silence? She'd been frightened at the thought of thieves, but more frightened still at the thought that it wasn't thieves. She went softly into her aunt's room so as not to wake her, but her aunt was already sitting straight upright in bed, her face white, her hand on her heart. From the street came more shots, more shouting, and then the sounds of glass breaking, cars screeching, a crash, and then another, of what might have been a wall falling down. They could smell fire, and her aunt thought it must be an invading army, or even a natural disaster of some sort. But as the shots came closer, they started to make out the Nazi language, the name-calling, and then the nature of the disaster became clear. Her aunt's husband had been a judge in the town, a decorated veteran of World War I. He had believed in 20th century Germany. Our fatherland, he called it. Where are the police? Her aunt kept asking. The girl didn't tell her her worst fears, that this was the police. The elderly housekeeper appeared in the doorway, and the three women groped their way downstairs to the kitchen and sat in the dark at the table in their nightgowns, waiting for the Nazis to smash in their door. Outside, the smashing and crashing ebbed and flowed around them, coming closer and then moving away, but never far enough. At dawn, the frail housekeeper got to her feet and made coffee. The girl said she put 2 lumps of sugar in each cup, which was not her way. But why not, she must have been thinking, if this was to be their last cup of coffee. The girl herself was a student of philosophy, studying a highly complicated system of mathematical probability. But the mystery of life had come clear to her that night. It was even elegant in its simplicity. If some random boy in the street scratched his head and shot her, then even the most abstract and intricate systems would be, as far as she was concerned, and in one fell swoop, solved. She was through with her studies, she said aloud then. Her aunt and the housekeeper nodded together as if they already knew. None of them moved. If there was any safety at all for them, it was there in the middle of the kitchen. The table had become a life raft, and the coffee an invisibility draft. Occasionally, the housekeeper rose to make more, but that activity seemed to fall within the sphere of safety. Anything else might break the spell. The 3 women sat and drank into the morning. There was still screaming and crashing from outside, and they still hadn't moved when sometime after noon there came a knock at the door. They sat terrified, but then a voice called her aunt's name politely, in the sort of tone not generally associated with the Nazis. And it turned out to be one of her late uncle's colleagues, a young man he'd helped along, now a judge himself. He'd come to get them out, he called, to his wife's mother's villa outside of town. Her aunt rose to pack a few things, but he said no, there was no time. He had a taxi waiting, and when they'd finally got her aunt into the car in her nightgown, he urged the man to drive fast and then faster. They had to take a circuitous route out of town because of all the fires, shops, houses, old places of worship, all blazing, with no attempt to put out the fires. Have they no water? Her aunt asked. But there was water, you could see it, for the buildings nearby. It was only selected targets that were left burning. The firemen were standing in front of them, arms folded, watching them burn. Her poor aunt couldn't comprehend, though. Why can't they do anything? She kept asking. Yes, yes, they told her, and finally she lay back and closed her eyes, which was good, because what would they have told her when they passed the children laughing and throwing stones through stained glass windows, and the men tossing leather books onto bonfires already sky high? The worst part, she said, though, were the well-dressed women, really fashionably dressed, people who looked like her friends or her parents' friends, people she could have known. It was hard to see them shouting and cheering on the destruction, holding up their babies to see. Hard to have to face the truth that it wasn't just the rabble on a rampage. It was everyone. The taxi had to detour down an elegant street where men were throwing china and crystal out of windows of some of the houses, crashing it down into the streets below. Things they could have used, things of value, even a grand piano. This she saw with her own eyes, saw men pushing a Bechstein over a balcony. It caught by one leg in the ironwork and hung there in midair to the wild cheering of the crowd below. The girl fell silent for a moment. Her listeners, too, sat stunned. To kill a man seemed easy these days, But to destroy a Bechstein piano built by hand over years with great art for great artists. Finally, from Herman, a hoarse, who? The girl shrugged. That was the point. Anyone, everyone. The ticket taker on the bus, the postman, the butcher's boy, the countess. Nice women with their children, but all out of their heads, raving like lunatics, all of them. Like something out of the Norse myths, the Furies, or the witch burnings 5 centuries before. No one knew to this day how many women they burnt, but some sources claimed hundreds of thousands, some said 1 million. Whole villages were left without one woman, she had read somewhere. She'd taken that as wild hyperbole at the time, but now she knew that whole towns could go mad. She had seen it, and seen too the way that it unhinged its victims. Now she understood the bizarre confessions that the accused witches had made, that they'd turned men into black cats and forced them into unspeakable acts on broomsticks. She could understand that now. She herself had looked fearfully at the birds in the trees that day, half fearing that they might fly at her too and peck out her eyes. When they drove across the gentle Moso River, she was surprised that it wasn't raging, actually surprised that it too hadn't joined the madness. It came to her then, she said, that this chaos, this insane destruction, was a perfect portrait of Germany after 1918 and the end of the war. The chaos in people's lives, the unemployment, the insane inflation, wheelbarrows full of their own good marks, worth nothing, and the crippled veterans home from a war that they hadn't realized they'd lost, with their lives in ruins. They had struggled with it for 20 years, the German people, each in their own private abstract desperation. But then Hitler had flung open their doors and taken them out of their dark rooms into the streets with someone real to chase down, to hate, to blame. Someone whose windows you could take the great pleasure of shattering with impunity now. She got to her feet. Anyway, she was through with all that, with trying to make sense, to understand. She was on her way to Romania, where she heard you could still get out. She had a cousin in America, but that was hopeless. There was said to be a line 3 deep surrounding the US consulate in Bucharest, and people who managed to get inside the palings were sleeping on the steps. But the British consulate was still giving a few visas, and she had a sister in England and could speak the language. She was hoping to find work as a governess there. And then perhaps study? Asked Herman. She laughed. How old are you? He asked her. 19, she said. Old. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Can you, oh, am I muted? Thank you, Victoria. That was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
I should say, hold on, Vicky, I loved it.
Oh, Amy,
Can't
thank
wait
you.
I can't wait to buy the book.
Oh, thank you.
I'm trying to get on video, not that there.
You are great.
And that was fabulous.
Oh, thank you. I have to say, I just, oh God, the subject.
Yeah.
It's so intense.
Yeah. I can't imagine what it took out of you to write this.
Well, it did take a lot, and there were some years when I thought, oh, I'm never going to have a good dream again. But, I became just so drawn into the story and to telling the story. It's tragedies are hard to read, like Hamlet is hard to read, or the Greek tragedy. But you become almost, they're worth it. That's the thing, they're worth it. And they take you to another place. And I got to the point where I was so into telling the story, writing it, reading about it, studying, that I had to make a rule that I couldn't go to my desk before 4 a.m. If I woke up at 3:30, I had to stay in bed. But But yeah, it was intense. And my poor family, you know, if somebody would say, I'm hungry, I would go, well, not compared to these people, you know, I
Yeah.
mean, it was kind of overwhelming.
Yeah, I can tell. Um, eh, anyway, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I, I'm, I'm really happy to hear what you had to say, and I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
You bet.
Do you, Victoria, do you want to take any, does anyone have any questions? Is that okay if they do, Victoria?
Oh, yes, of course.
Anyone want to, if they're, you can write it in the chat if you don't feel like speaking. There's a chat button on the bottom.
I'm trying to think, some of the things I've been asked, people asked about the process, which is, it can be interesting. I, uh, Herman's daughter, the Herman of the letter, which kind of starts the book, is printed in the book, you know, word for word. That is unchanged. And then I did find out that his daughter had left a video, and so I
Wow.
listened to that and started with that. Well, I started by listening to the people talking, you know, at the museum, going every day. Then I listened to her video. Then I started listening to a lot of other videos, you know, and as well as doing research. And you know, it was there's an archive at USC. I happened to be in LA, which was kind of great because there was this archive at USC that Steven Spielberg has funded, with videotapes of people who had been through various death camps, and I listened to a lot of those. Also.
One question, could you read us the last words in the book?
Sorry?
Could you read us the last words in the book?
Oh, let me get it. I'm at I'm at a friend's house. Wait, John, can you get me a copy of the plum trees that's on the bookshelf in there? It's on the bookshelf in there. I'm out here I'm out here at my friend Kirsten's house,
Yeah.
out my things, but she has a copy of the book, so I can do that.
That'd be good.
While you're looking for it, Vicki, this is Robin. I'm sorry, I don't have a camera on this. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't have a camera on this old computer
Oh,
that works, so I'm black. But in any case, I have read the book, and I just couldn't put it down, although I have never read anything like this. So for me, it was horrific. You know, I always knew the story, but to actually live through it, through these girls, as you wrote it and imagined it, was tremendous. And then Sibby said, I just don't know how you were able to do it, actually. But I think now that you're going to read the end, I think, is it changing? Is it what you call spilling the beans for others to say that you actually found one of these girls at the end?
You just spilled the beans.
well,
Yeah.
I think,
Well,
I think, I mean,
it's interesting. It isn't the point of the story anyway. It's just,
no, it isn't. It isn't.
no, not at all. So that was fascinating, though, that,
It was, it was unbelievable. You
yeah.
know, unbelievable. I just,
Well, and when you talk about arriving in the neighborhood you're in,
wow,
finding them, it just
incredible.
doesn't come, it sort of comes full circle, but it doesn't anyway.
Right, exactly. I mean, it is very much real life, I guess.
Yeah.
Oh, I
In
will,
New York, this is in New York,
New
everybody.
York, yeah. On
Yeah,
the,
so it's close.
you know, taking the D train out to is it a Borough Hall, I think it is. The last part of the book, do you mean that, like, should I start? I don't know, what should
I
I
don't
read?
know. That was letting you make the
Paragraph?
choice of what, just to sort of get the feeling of where you left it.
I think I will. Oh, okay, so this is just a half a page.
Good.
Kansi, which is the name of the protagonist in the book, or the narrator, or kind of, went back to the small hotel in the village where she was staying and dreamed that night of the camps, some version of the camps, with death in the offing. In the dream, there were many men, great men, Freud, Jung, friends, others, all threatened with imminent murder. But 3 gray cats came in to lead them to freedom, not to safety, she remembered knowing, but at least out. They were beautiful cats. When she awoke, she remembered the gray cats of Freya, the Norse goddess. The Norse myths were different from the Greeks, or for that matter, from the Hebrews, harsher with their storm gods and evil elves, and in the end, all-out destruction, as Hitler should have known from the start. But there was beauty too, stark and stirring. That whiff of cold, fresh air, clean from the mountains, and the horns, the bells, the music and the wind. The gods drank their mead, and you could hear them forging magic tools in their caves, hear their hammers ringing through the mountains. Sometimes they unleashed terrible storms on the world, but Freya was beautiful, and come spring, Heimdall would blow his magic horn, and then men, yes, Hitler, men like Herman, could come out again and plant their plum trees in the sun.
Yeah, a lot in that. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Vicky,
That's very nice of you to ask for that.
That was beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Vicky, thank you so much. I'm so glad
Thank
you
you, Joan. This
I
is,
loved hearing it. And I
thank
look forward to reading. I thought it's a beautiful closing paragraph or
you.
2 paragraphs or whatever it is. But
Oh,
I
yeah.
wanted to say I've been to Auschwitz,
Oh, really?
and listening to this even was when you talked about her beautiful long hair.
Ugh.
I mean, I saw all that hair that was, in the and it sort of numbed me again to hear this because when I left, I couldn't fathom it because it's so visible what happened there. And all I could think of, which is not unrelated in certain ways to today, which is we went in, we saw the train, all the people who were brought in to Auschwitz were brought in on a train, and there were farms along the way. And we came in on a bus and left because I had been at Krakow with a poetry group and we took this side trip. Anyway, all I could think of was those farmers who were there watching these trains come in loaded with people and then go out empty. And, what was their position? If they did anything, they would end up being dead. And if they didn't do anything, I'm sure they were thinking to themselves, if I stay alive, maybe I can do something,
Yeah. Which is, the great lesson of that is like you have to act right away and in unison. You can't let these things go on and think, oh, that's just them, although I guess in that case it was just them, but still, they had to live with it.
Or
Yeah.
that Hitler is he's going to take care of this and then he'll stop or something. All this fantasy that goes on because it's so horrific. How can you possibly face or digest, the potential of what's really there?
Exactly.
Thank you for tonight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, following on Joan, could I just say, reading the book, what I found most terrifying was not so much asking what I would have done if I knew that was happening and I could be killed for stepping in, but what you suggested at the beginning is that these people were so like us. They were living good lives. Their children had music lessons. They were enjoying life. They were planting gardens in their backyards. And suddenly things started to happen. And yet with each incursion on normality and the political system as they knew it, as you said, when your father or your grandfather offered this uncle the chance to come, he said, this is Czechoslovakia and we're a democracy. How could this happen? It was more that with each transgression, people said, oh, that's not right. But it won't go any further. They
Right.
couldn't do that. They couldn't do that. And even in the camps, you had a feeling of, through the participants, that they were saying, you know, what are they doing with those people? They're marching in that direction. At first, you know, they began to understand, but it was more this sense that it was so incremental, and when you were finally there, you said, oh my God, now I see where this was going, but it's too late. And that's what was terrifying to me,
Right, and in
because
a
I
way,
could relate to that in our own,
yeah.
at least political experience of,
But it's hard to draw a lesson because obviously in this case, Herman should have left, you know, but he would have been, he was very well-to-do, lived a cultured life, was part of a community where he lived. If he had fled to America, which of course he should have and would have done, he would have been poor, he wouldn't speak the language, he would have,
right.
you know. So when does one know to leave? You know, there's this optimism that we all have, you know, and that we all conjure. And, you know, for us, it would be like all of a sudden someone tells you, okay, you're walking away from your house. You can take hardly any money out of the bank and you're on your way to China, you know, as I don't even, you know, the poorest of the poor, you know, and you may or may not find your footing.
Vicki,
So,
it's also about leaving your homeland.
I mean, yeah, you know, and your friends and everything you love,
Home
everything you love.
and thinking or knowing you will never return. I think it's very easy for
Yes,
easy
that's
for
true.
me to not focus on how tough that must be to do. You know, to really just
Yeah,
minimize what that would mean. But if you actually think about, if somebody came up tomorrow and said you need to leave now and you're never going to come back again, the stuff and the photographs are important and all of that, but just the idea that your homeland,
yeah,
you know, and there's so many books out now about around that issue for various people that it's interesting. Anyway,
yeah.
Well, in addition to that, it's timely because that's what's happening all over the world right now. And I keep going back to what it must have taken out of you to live while you wrote it.
Yeah, I'm glad it was, you know, I wrote it about 10 years ago now, and
It-
that was good.
Victoria, can I ask a question, please?
Yes, of course.
I'm almost finished the book and there's so much nonfiction in the story. I was just wondering about that lawyer Kastner. Is he
Yes.
is he a true character? I
Oh,
mean,
yes, absolutely.
that was really
Absolutely. Isn't
horrible.
that unbelievable?
I mean,
Yeah,
I
that's,
thought I had read enough horrible things until I got to that section. So anyway.
I know. No, that's a true story. I mean, everything in the book is true. It's just that it isn't just one person's story. It's told sort of as if it was, but it wasn't. It's many different testaments. I have a lot of it. I have end notes, sort of saying, you know, referring to who the speaker was a lot of times. I think for everyone actually. And the Kastner part, that's an obscure. I mean, it just has to do with you know, at that point I had listened to everyone. Well, actually I hadn't, but I was trying to figure out about an escape from Auschwitz at that point. And I listened to a man speaking who was in Australia. He was a Czech. And he told a story, he told about an escape that was incredible to me, and about a betrayal that was overwhelming. And I don't want to really go into it because it's part of the book, you know, but I listened to this and listened to this man tell this, and then went and researched it and couldn't believe it. One, I'd never heard of it. Hannah Arendt writes about it actually, and she was criticized intently for that. When she wrote about it, when she was writing about Eichmann in Jerusalem. I don't know if anyone's read that book. I did in this research. It's really interesting. So yeah, it's true. It's horrifying, but it's true. Somebody did escape. There was a spectacular escape in order to, because people didn't know that these were death camps, believe it or not. People in Hungary or in Czechoslovakia far away. I mean, the Polish farmers, near there had to know. And people who saw the trains going through knew something, but these people were told that they were going to work, which made sense, a lot more sense than what actually was happening. They were told that they were going to work camps. So they thought, okay, we'll go and we'll work and we'll survive the war. By that point, it was 1944. It was clear that the Nazis were losing. And then they could even hear Russian tanks. They could see the English planes flying over, American planes starting to fly over. So everyone knew which way the war was going. So they thought, okay, we're being pushed into these boxcars, and they didn't expect to be pushed in like that with no water. But by the time that happened, it was too late. But they were told they were going to pick grapes somewhere in Tokai or to work in a factory. They thought that made sense. So they got on the trains, but the minute they got on the trains, they were lost. And the people who were working at Auschwitz, there were workers there who had been there long enough to see this and know what was happening, got together. There was also an underground in the camp by 1944. So they got together and helped these two men escape, and they actually made a successful escape. And then that was betrayed. So anyway, very, very intense stories, one after another, which is why, in a way, we can still be interested in this, because we still haven't heard it all or told it all or listened to it all or thought about it all.
Well, some people don't even believe it happened.
Believe that. Oh, right. I know that, I'm so glad you brought that up, because when I was starting to write this book, or when I, was given the letter to read, I was involved in another book, another project. This is not my field really. And, but there was a lot of Holocaust denial going on in Iran, I guess, and in Europe. And I just thought that this book would maybe help that a bit, because these things clearly happened, so.
What kind of men joined the SS? Were they totally uneducated, or they just?
Some of them were really educated and very elegant, which is, but most of them were, I mean, a lot of them had were perverse in one way or another before they joined. So it was a perfect, a lot of them were sadists, like Mengele, who escaped, in the end, and lived in Brazil, not far from where we lived for many years. He was dead by the time we moved down there, but it's funny because he drowned, he lived to drown on a beach, which, it's just incredible that there was no earthly justice for that guy anyway. And it's funny, he drowned on really what was a beautiful beach, but I knew that he drowned on that particular beach. It was called Bertioga. And one time Kirsten, actually living in Brazil, asked me to go with her to that beach, but I just couldn't go to that beach. I went to beaches on either side of it all the time, but that beach just seemed defiled to me. Unfair to the beach, of course, but there it is. Anyway, so.
Thank you, Victoria. That was really moving. And I highly recommend the book. I just finished it a few days ago, and it was hard to read, and it was hard to put down.
Exactly.
You know, it was, there were moments when you just had to stop and take it in, and I can't imagine the act of writing it. Must have been taxing, to say the least.
Yeah.
But does anyone else have any questions or comments?
Well,
Then
I
I
want to say thank you all so much for coming, and I hope I see all of you here. We're here till mid-July, so hoping to see anyone is here, so that I know. So
thank you so much for sharing this with us. And at your next book, maybe we'll be able to have you at the actual library, which would be wonderful.
thank you so much.
Thank
I
you.
hope that her next book is gives you some relief from all of this agony. I mean, it must
Yeah.
be.
Definitely.
Oh, you need some happiness now. It's
Yes.
a beautiful, beautiful book.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you
Oh,
so much. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you, and good night, everyone.
Thank you, Vic.
Thank you, Vicki.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Jocelyn.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.
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 Bye.